Gone over again and again by Edward and Jeremy, no doubt. This was 30 years ago that we began as a group. I thought today that if we had been sitting and thinking of at a lecture on something 30 years previously, it would have been 1927, you see. We would have been attending a talk by some idiots who were working in 1927 in Germany or somewhere. So the gap is pretty long. It's very difficult to conceive if you are still here. I'd like to start with reading out a text on the Grunt Group that I wrote for this pamphlet. The Grunt Group and the AA. The Grunt Group grew out of the AA of exactly 30 years ago. Then every project was based on a typical brief for a real building in current practice. Access to any critical review required the display of a design for a building, developed to a fair degree of detail. Research and experiment were not unimportant, but such pre-architectural factors, note by Alan Cahoon, were of interest only in terms of their interpretation in the vocabulary of building. I put that in because I think David wants something said like that. I also put it in because the work we did was based on that education which required that everything was to do with building in practice. We conducted ourselves in the fifth year as a kind of small professional office, I seem to remember, coming in at 9:30 and having coffee break at 11 and working together until 10 o'clock at night without being paid, just like everybody in practice. The other text is as follows: The Grunt Group and my part in it. The group lasted from the mid-1960s until the mid-1970s. In its early days, it was described as neo-purist. Walter Siegel said that. The lost generation, Martin Pauly said that. The cool school, I think David Wilde must have said that. Because of a radical severity in the work that was reminiscent of early modernism and the international style. I remember Edward being described as the oldest living architect of the 1920s. New York 5 and the American whites had not yet been invented. In fact, whatever the building to be done, which in our case happened to be the large-scale structures of the welfare state and post-war reconstruction, housing, schools, and then whole townships, whole universities, I was interested in forms that were not typical of modernism. I thought that geometrical and organic figures with a complete emblematic quality at the scale of the whole program and site could supply a better backbone to complex planning problems than was suggested by the modernists' hierarchies and grids. I thought that a fear about the loss of individual identity in mass society was distorting architecture, creating pressure for it to be interesting, full of richness, complexity, variety, originality, etc. It couldn't be modest or straightforward. In Britain, a nervously urgent desire to superimpose upon architecture the characteristics of an ebbing historical identity was accompanied by a resurgent nostalgia for the literal symbols of the past. Even that apparently progressive and certainly most poetic of movements, the New Brutalism, referred in the end to a nostalgic landscape already superseded and dethroned. I was a bit of a back-to-basics type. I had written a thesis on Owen Williams, who had established a company called Basic Buildings Limited to build blocks of flats. I wanted to find a clean, uncluttered, delicate architecture, free of culture. My desires caused problems, even among other members of the group, since they resulted in extremely dry, formal schemata that were, quote, hard to take, which Stirling said when he saw our Netherfield schemes at Milton Keynes. What I'd like to do is just show some of my part in it work. some of which was done with Edward, most of it was done with Edward, some by myself, and some with other partners. Then I'd like to show a sort of rake's progress very quickly of what's happened since. Then I'd like to dwell on a couple of recent things and some ideas, recent ideas. It's difficult to talk about ideas in a rake's progress, but I shall try and do it in the recent work. Here goes with my part in it. Could we have the lights off? I think the whole thing was summarized in a particular issue of Architectural Design, which is there on the left. I think that's me on the cover with Clipstone Street behind it, but it consisted of a summary of quite a lot of built work between 1965 and 1975, or perhaps a bit earlier. No, it was 1972, that publication, 65 and 72, which had a certain character to it by the various motley assembled crew. This is my understanding of the beginning of it as far as I'm concerned. This was done with Edward and is our Ports Down competition. On the left is a drawing I did some 15, 20 years later to add to it. It was some kind of repetitious organism in my mind. It was like a hotel under glass that was not tall but laid out on the ground. Then I did Clipstone Street, which is round the corner here, just under the post office tower. I just want to show you these, and then I'll try and say a little bit, something about them. If I go back a step, the picture on the left is a part of the site as it was. And I want to come back to this in some kind of assessment of what, not the Grunt Group work, but the context as well that it worked in. Nobody is strong enough to completely dominate the context they worked in. And if there's something to feel still happy about, there are things to still feel okay about. There are some things not to feel okay about. And I feel that the programs were dubious, is the thing that I'm unhappy about. And there were 200 Georgian houses which were demolished in favor of Clipstone Street. This project. On the right is another project following this, which is called Carleton Road, 90 houses in a new street. Entry for Amsterdam City Hall, Clipstone Street, carrying on. Block of flats at Carleton Road. Another thing with Edward, Haringey housing. Another thing with Edward. I'll try to quickly say something, I suppose, about these. This was a series of projects which we felt we had acquired an approach to housing at large scale and high density, which was here represented as houses, traditional houses, terraced houses, with new streets, terraces of houses, communal gardens. We thought we had cracked it. This is my entry with John Jenner and Lois Price and others for the Northampton competition, which was actually won by Jeremy's project. We all did it. Jeremy's won. We all worked on Jeremy's. This was a township under glass. It had a city square, it had a pools, it had a city square, it had housing, as it were, all under glass for the city City Hall functions. Had street corners with cafes. It sat lightly on the ground, was demountable. This was really the Grunt Group together. This is Jeremy, Edward, myself, and Chris doing Netherfield at Milton Keynes. We thought when we began that we knew we were able to handle, with the equipment we had, with the previous works, to grasp the nettle of building at very large scale. That was the situation. On the right, on the far right, is the whole southern sector of Milton Keynes, more or less. And we designed it. We produced drawings which designed there. I think there's 7,000 or 8,000 people, housing and associated infrastructure, drawn on a single sheet of paper by us and built after that. This was difficult to manage, but we wanted to do that. Compared to seeing it all broken up. There on the right is it under construction, Netherfield under construction. The roofs were all at the same level. The thing was in grand terraces with large gardens in between. I then continued myself to another project, the next grid square, not with the others, but with Peter Barker. And this is Coffee Hall, the plan for Coffee Hall. These are some of the ideas behind it. And here it is. I'm not really, I think I just want to finish at a certain point. And that is the point. That really is the end of the Grunt Group. This is 1973, 1974. There were many other projects. There are all the projects, of course, of the others. These are ones I participated in. There are others that I participated in. I can remember several others with Edward. The ones that are missed out here are the Rooftops in Covent Garden project. And finally, we entered Roosevelt Island in New York. Edward and I sat and worked at the, with our staff at the time, our assistants, on a project for Roosevelt Island in New York. The housing project, like all these had been, most of these had been. And I think that's the turning point. What happened was that we worked on that until we had produced virtually the drawings ready to submit. We were 3 days, I think, away from the submission. It's a very large project, quite a fair investment in doing it. And at some point, Edward taking the lead, as I now realize was an important moment, said that we should stop this, and walked away from it, and we agreed we would walk away from it. We did not hand that project in. The reasons behind this were that we were exhausted. I think we had exhausted a certain evolution of an approach. It was exhausted. We were employed to work on these huge projects at the age of 27, 28, whatever. And I don't think there's any housing project I know of that's any bigger than the ones that we were put to do. And when we did Roosevelt Island, which was as big as any of them, nearly as big as these projects, we felt that something had passed away. We stopped that. From that moment on, I think that's what I would call the end of the Grunt Group. That was 1975, I think. My own work then, and all the rest of us, all went in our own directions. Not unamicably at all. We just found that we needed to change. And the pressure was growing to do something else. I myself began working with a series of other partners with whom I enjoyed fresh, different experiences. And this was the first one was Millbank with Marion Mashter. And it was an attempt to enlarge the language that we had found.
It's not Millbank.
This is not Millbank, I'm sorry, this is Dublin, City Keys Dublin. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, the man at the back.
Well, you know, it could be anywhere.
Could be anywhere. Before I go on to this, I think there's a little recap on why show all this work. Or there's no real reason. There is a characteristic about it. It was remembered. It was at the time, and now of course it doesn't seem so at all. At the time, it caused the greatest difficulty. I only remember any review or criticism or publication of all that work being accompanied by extraordinarily vituperative criticism. This is now hard to even think of. These projects do not look that, I'm sure, they do not look that contentious. They somehow did at the time. They ranged from, the criticisms ranged from, I don't know, Walter Siegel writing that this was a sad anachronism, Martin Pauly that it was the lost generation, Leon Creer wrote of projects, I'm not quite clear whether it was ours, but I suspect it was, as the projects at Milton Keynes as disgusting housings. Where the ire came from, can't quite recall, and I think events have taken over. Projects are bigger now than they were then, even. I can't remember what it was. There was a certain edge in trying not to fall into the conventions of humanitarian architecture as it was then understood. This is a long time ago, and the debate at the time was between a kind of Herrenfolk vernacular liberalism of brick buildings and individuality and so forth, and what we were doing, which is now no longer to be seen, I don't think, as anything spectacularly contentious. But then it was, and I think it's on that there is even a name remembered at all, such as the Grunt Group. I shall now whiz through the Rake's progress, I hope. I hope to be able to whiz through it. Through a series of further expansions of the elementarist foundations that I think I was trying to deal with myself and together with the others. We stepped here into a kind of historicism. It was a desperate attempt to add more to other vocabulary. City Key Dublin, it's a housing project. And at this point, drawings themselves seem to be a stimulus. The nature of the drawings one drew seemed to be a stimulus to adding more components to the vocabulary that one had. Millbank, 1976, with Marion again. Attempts to, through certain procedures of research and experiment and drawing, to draw upon, in this case, natural phenomena as a new component for an informative vocabulary in design. The drawing on the right is done many years later, in fact, for an exhibition at the Max Protech Gallery in New York. Most of these drawings are now in, most of the drawings that are here are in private collections. This lot are in the collection of Mr. Houthacker in Amsterdam. There is the Swan's Necks, which David referred to, which was a project for a health club, a swimming pool, with English landscape transformed into, with swans and lake and trees as the pool. On the left is a drawing called Shells Only, which came from the another technique for evolving research was arbitrary associations such as the use of an expression which was in the brief, which asked for some of the apartments to be designed as shells only. This would have led to the furniture designs. This was an excursion, obviously, into the figurative a little further, less into natural elements and now into figurative symbolism. With Justina Karakiewicz, this was taken from the flag of Saudi Arabia, and we didn't really know what we were getting ourselves involved in. Well, quite a lot evolved out of this. The swords mean, of course, believe or die. We thought they were just the swords on the flag. They said, the Saudis said, peace with justice is what it means. This was not built. It was exhibited in the Venice Biennale in 1980, and there's been a bizarre consequence of the building by Saddam Hussein and his hench architect in Baghdad, of which we know nothing, we're not consulted. It had a 4-inch deep pool and a restaurant underneath at each side of the motorway. There's the client. Sent us site photographs. Client sent us site photographs with himself prominent in his Cadillac in the foreground, so we sent back drawings with him prominent in the foreground in his Cadillac. Still didn't get us the job. This was now for the opposition. This is the city engineer of Jerusalem, an invited entry for doing something to the what was called the seam, the wasteland at the ex-border between, kind of checkpoint Charlie border between East and West Jerusalem. And we produced these projects, which I won't go into. I think the visual part of these, I've chosen the illustrations, the illustrative drawings rather than the plans, etc., in the hope that this might give a flavour rather than get bogged down in discussing the plans. At this point, I can just say, quote, a reference. To give a flavour, there's some words to give a flavour of this period. I can't read this. Peter Wilson wrote at this point, he distances himself from the shadows of contemporary fashion. Earlier, Purist work was not, as is commonly thought, abandoned with the plunge into the figurative. Its architectonic discipline now exists just below the decorative surface. I wrote something I can't read because it's too small. For the Venice catalogue. Next, work expanded further on the figurative and now narrative. This is I picked on a story to see to experiment freely whether a project could be devised from a story, which was the story of Danae, Danae and the Tower of Gold. Danae was locked up in a tower and approached by Zeus in the form of a shower of gold. At this point, there was the competition for the international competition for an architect-designed doll's house. And this is my daughter Camille in the doll's house. You see, her father locked her up in a tower. I won't go into all this sort of crap. There's the tower on exhibition in America, I think. There are now 3 towers, 2 of them traveling around America and one in a collector has bought one in England. The child could go up inside this. Keep animals and friends in it. These were the dolls. And metallics became interesting through drawing, and in turn in architecture, metallic reflective surfaces became interesting. Doll's house was fully equipped with a staircase for the children, little rooms for the dolls, fully equipped with lighting, interior designs, suitable for Elle Decoration magazine. No, sorry. And at this same sort of period, there was a larger competition, which was confusing because it was for a military library, which hardly has the same sort of connotations. The Shrivenham Library. And it seemed to have some influence from the previous projects. The library plan is on the left. I thought that you could perhaps do a library which carried another message as well, that was nothing to do with it. Perhaps it would be a building which explored the subject of Danae and the shower of gold in a building which had no necessary connection with the brief. So there is a tower with a tree captured in the plan is to capture a tree in the plan or in the building, and outside is an existing reservoir which has been made into a moon lake, parking all round the edge. It's all on black asphalt paving. I mean, not paving, black asphalt on the site with cars around the edge. The metallics became an interest in design of the building. So it would have metallic reflective glass with clamps on the glass and handrails, etc. The tree appeared to grow out of it. This is the figurative architecture going to extremes, I suppose, in that I won't dwell on all the features of this project. These are experiments in what motifs it might carry. On the right is another version which has lances with flags at the top protecting the roof garden and weird heads at the bottom where the lances appear to be long conical hats on top of these heads, and the heads are mounted on marble with red streaks in it so that the blood would be coming from the necks of the figures that were at the bottom of the lances, and barbed wire for railings at the top. This is La Défense, a new partner, Will Alsop and John Lyle. Sunk without a trace, didn't get anywhere. It was a huge, its essence was a large screen, 100 meters high and 100 meters wide, which was an electronic screen. This is the New Squares project with Robert Griffin to revive the center of the cities with magnificent new squares. Around the cornices would be, the cornice was designed as an illustration of people in a public place, in a kind of perspective, flattened perspective. They would be made of curved metallic elements, and they were in screen to the roof gardens. And it was a panorama of people. The square was filled with water and had an island in the middle of it. This seems to be a return to rather severe, except for the cornice. This is being naughty again and being rather severe. Studies for the people. Followed by entry for grand buildings, Trafalgar Square. This time the people, obviously the people in Trafalgar Square with pigeons at their feet. Pigeons, real pigeons intersecting with artificial pigeons, and real people intersecting with artificial people. On the left is an upside-down drawing of a project I did with James Gowan, with James's help, to produce an alternative to a proposed development, which was to drastically interfere with the Schreiber House in Hampstead, which is on the right of the plan on the right, and a large new block of flats by myself with James's acquiescence on the left. This was done for Camden to help in an appeal against a planning application for a monstrous building which I'm afraid has failed. This is a building for Lord Kennet, which is I'd like to speak about on another occasion, or write about, because it was the privilege to be able to work on a building and destroy it by the Smithsons. Not a privilege to destroy it, I mean the drawing on the left, fortunately, we never built, which is an extension of what's called the Wayland Young Pavilion, which is the building with a tree growing out of the middle of it, you may remember, by Alison Peter Smithson. And we were asked to add to it, and eventually we did something I think you will find not quite so appalling, which I will go into at another point. Suffice it to say that there was it boiled down to building a water butt against the house and a store. And rebuilding the kitchen, which was a very charming, brutal kitchen, and we had the temerity to rip it out and build another one. Otherwise, tried to preserve it. That is, I think, the best building of the brutalist period, and should have been like the Green and Green House in Pasadena, a public place, but it isn't. This is the Penguin Cafe, which has been well published in not too distant past, in the aid files. Here is a project done for the Glasgow City Corporation and the city housing architect to deal. This isn't the project. Yes, I suppose you might think it could well be. This is the situation we found ourselves to deal with, the largest and most dismal housing project in Europe, perhaps. Our project was to add the forms of houses you see through a particularly pleasant part of the site which had a river running through it, and to face them inwards to this new prospect. Here is a large project in Glasgow which failed due to the recession, of 80,000 square feet of offices, and the essay here is, again, back to abstraction and glass detailing. Right, thank you. Finally, I would like to switch gear and show some recent work where I would like to just mention an idea or two and show the current recent project. This is for adding flavour reasons to the rate's progress. The flavour here, and in all those projects which I've run through, is the grappling with ideas that are too large to handle. It's not just that the projects were often too large to handle. Even on small projects, I have found the ideas that I have had extremely hard to handle. They lead to a kind of oscillation between a positive idea and its negative. In this case, the subject that has preoccupied me and Paul Shepherd and one or two others, perhaps Jean, to do with the landscape, has touched it too, is the subject Paul and I invented called Demolition. Demolition is about viewing architecture from the angle of it being absent or demolished. I wrote an essay 3 or 4 years ago in Zodiac magazine called Sacred Space in the Modern Age, and here is another essay on the left which I wrote in a Canadian magazine called Ideal Cities and Demolition. They deal with the subject of the absence, that the ideal place is one when nobody is, for example, and other concepts which I think I might find too difficult to, they've been so difficult to deal with, they'd be difficult to express, but let me see. Last year there was an exhibition called Sacred Space in the Modern Age in the Venice Biennale. I attended that because we had produced a synagogue design which was built in 1992 to 93. Participating in the discussion about sacred space, I felt it obliged to point out that the most sacred places were not churches at all, were not synagogues at all, were not mosques at all. Sacred places were something else altogether. Unfortunately, the discussion at those meetings centered, attended by eminences from the Roman Catholic, the Protestant, the Muslim, and the rabbinical quarters of the monotheistic religions, were very keen, of course, that churches and synagogues and mosques, they would have loved them to be sacred places. Of course, they're not. They may be dedicated, but they're not what I understand as sacred place. I felt obliged to try and speak about that. But it's part of a wider discussion about a demolitionist discussion. Stonehenge, for example, is a place of pilgrimage to millions. It has more people visited, I think, than Westminster Abbey in a year. I may be slightly wrong. I'm not sure if that's a good statistic. Why do they go there? Nobody knows what it is. There's an absence of so many things. There's an absence of meaning to it. Nobody knows what it is. There's an absence of people at it. If you like, it's a London, in my mind, it's a London that doesn't exist. It's the ideal London. Londoners go to it all the time. Another place of great sanctity in architectural terms is, although sanctified places could be a tree in an empty landscape or a strange outcrop of rock, is the Pantheon, another building known to be one of the great buildings, but nobody knows really what it was. It is empty now, certainly, not used. Grappling with these concepts, there was a question of whether, having identified sacred space as something that was not was remote, uninhabited often, places with a significance in the mind, but not without building. This is talking oneself out of a job, as it were. I then sought to keep oneself in work. What is there such a thing as a sacred place that is designed by architects? Could be designed. And the nearest I came up with was Central Park in New York, on the right. If you go into a grove such as between those massive granite rocks, on your walk in Central Park, you can for a moment feel that kind of feeling that you might get from a sacred grove in an old Greek place. Naturally, this is partly because the place is ancient. The rocks are ancient. But it is to do with the context as well, and it was and there is a designer, it is designed. I thought perhaps Frederick Law Olmsted was able to do a sacred place. There are many things about Central Park that give this impression. It is, I tried to extract from it what it was. It is a great contrast between nature and the man-made, essentially. It has no history. It has nobody knows, or at least I didn't know, what it means. Why was Central Park set aside as a reservation for not building upon? And this echoes the theme of demolition. It's not built upon, and yet it is the most important place in New York. We began to think that planning, ideal planning, consists of not building. And more mundanely, planning is, the way we plan is mostly, or most effectively done by prevention of building. Streets, roads, public ways, vistas, a number of things that are anti-building. Trying to follow up further whether there was sacred places or places which have a certain quality and feeling to them which I can't describe very well, but feel in architecture, the nearest one could come up with was these two. On the left isn't a piece of architecture at all, it's a painting. It's creating a piece of architecture, a painter creating a piece of architecture. And the elements in it have a magic that is nearly building. I think the painter here is creating something of magic qualities that are nearly buildable. And on the right is to do with the landscape, a built landscape, which has a sacral quality to it. This, in this case, this is one of the figures from the Glastonbury Zodiac. And walking around Glastonbury, this was preserved by the monks of Glastonbury for hundreds of very long time, and the whole landscape has a certain feel to it. The lady who first saw it and felt these feelings about this landscape was Mrs. Maltwood, who then collected aerial photographs and discovered that there were these great figures in the landscape. I think that is a piece of architecture that has the kind of qualities one is grasping at. On the more ordinary level of architecture, we by this time had a brief for a building which had some association with this topic, which was that we had won a competition for the building of a new synagogue in the East End of London. We were looking at buildings that had some kind of a bit more nearer to the sort of program of a brief for a building. What building does have a certain quality that is enigmatic or doesn't have the associations of, in this case, this is the church whose name I continually forget, up the wonderful steps that are adjoining the more famous steps of Michelangelo up to the Capitoline Hill. This church is mesmerizing and draws my eye away from the Capitoline Hill. The Michelangelo details on the right, on the left-hand picture, are fabulous and rich, but the building on the left has no details, as it were. It has no connotative details. I think we are returning to an abstract search for an abstract vocabulary again, or something of that kind. But the things about this building are, it's brick. It has these holes in it. I'm not very good at true histories or authenticated histories. My observations are wanderings of my own mind. I saw those holes initially, perhaps they were holes to hold up a would-be stone facade that would have been ornamented with Roman, Corinthian or whatever details. Then I thought, no, it never was, and these holes are for pigeons or for doves, as a dovecot across the whole facade. Otherwise, so the building perhaps in my mind never had any ornament of any recognizable kind. It has this very extraordinary cornice affair, which is manipulating brickwork into a strange curved effect, which does have a practical purpose. It shields the entrance to the building way below with a deeply overhanging cornice. It seemed a modern building to me. Apart from on the left, there are, of course, a couple of Gothic giveaway details, but on the whole, this building is timeless. I tried to begin sketching the building, which was to have an oculus. On the left is a bathhouse. The light seems very important. I'm not going to pretend that in speaking of the ideas, I just wanted to, as with the rest of the work shown, a glimpse into a kind of way of adventuring through a series of ideas and how difficult they are to grasp and deal with, and how difficult it is to make buildings when these ideas are at the back of one's mind. And when we're now going into the building that resulted during this period, of course, I'm not pretending that this building is a sacred place or has anything touching the grandeur of the things one can perceive. One can't build to match one's perception by any means. Anyway, it has an oculus in the middle. This is a prayer hall. And I think I should rush on so that whatever David was describing as going on upstairs could soon be discovered. This is the South West Essex Reformed Synagogue. It does have, I will say that I think it does have a peaceful effect and calming effect as a space when you go into it, into the prayer hall. It's part of a complex of buildings of which I'm only dealing with the prayer hall. It has classrooms and social spaces and functions halls and libraries and a library and so forth. This is the prayer hall. Edward and Chris Woodward have included it in the book on their book on the architecture of London, but I don't think they actually have seen. I don't think you've seen the interior finish. So I hope to be able to show Edward the interiors, which we were able to do. I was quite pleased about. That's a computer perspective on the right, done before the building was developed. Lighting the way light came in seemed to be a value. It should have had an even higher ceiling. It's 7 meters, 6.5 meters. I'm sure I needn't describe why there were little tiny windows all the way around to do with the way the sun comes through at different times of the day. You see a little ball there underneath the oculus, which is a counterweight to the eternal flame, which is in an plain dish of oil with a wick, which is suspended over the dais. This building has innovations in the details of the type of prayer space required for a synagogue, in that I don't think there is another example where it's all been... synagogues have a difficulty in planning. They're not like churches, which have an altar, a baptistry, and other features that do find a place, a choir. In a synagogue, there are conflicting elements. You have the Ark of the Covenant, where the scrolls are kept. You have a reader who is supposed to face east, but who also now wants to face the people. Everybody should face east, and there's a whole complex set of problems. It's resolved here by putting all of it on a dais, which is unprecedented. The light from the oculus comes through and shines on a different part of the congregation and blinds them temporarily every week. The eternal lamp was suspended from the middle of a clear acrylic dome as big as I could get, which was 2.4 meters. And the engineer and nobody else would accept putting this thing in the middle of the acrylic dome, so I went along and did it myself with Russell Bagley, who made the lamp of Box Products. So we clambered up there, and I held the lamp. I brought my poker, my electric poker, which I've been practicing with for a couple of weeks. Had the client's equivocal sort of, all right, you can try it, but it's your problem, and so forth. And poked a hole through the acrylic with Russell on top. Smoke poured into the double skin, and all sorts of little bits of shards of plastic went everywhere, and the whole thing was rather problematic. Russell was on top, and with the builder, who 5 minutes prior to this had proved that you could suspend this thing by sitting his 16 stone bulk on the thing in the middle of the dome to prove that it was all right. Russell was up there with the builder, and I was underneath, and I started tightening the nuts that I had designed from below, and he started tightening the nuts that I had designed from above. And the screw threads didn't seem to sort of match up in each of our perceptions, and he was unscrewing while I was screwing up, and the whole thing fell on the floor. I won't go into all these sort of things, the sort of things you get on the... It's a sweet little lamp with Russell and I did. There are hair cracks in the paving, did appear, and small amounts of mortar came up out of the paving, at which point the client stopped paying the fees, and we've been in litigation ever since, and I can no longer go into this building. And I've dealt fumblingly with the concept of demolition and the absence of things, but here is an illustration of the fact that the building looks particularly interesting when it's empty and unfinished and has no signs of human occupancy, except the builders, of course, but I mean it is uninhabited, really. Looks better. Finally, a couple of current projects, very briefly indeed. This is a new, it's also a building of religious significance. This is was to be a Sukkah, which is for the West London Synagogue in Marble Arch, which is a place like for a harvest festival. It has to have a roof light open to the sky. It is designed to have a pergola built for the dressing it with harvest produce, which is demounted when the festival is over from its position underneath the large roof light, and all the elements of it are to be housed around the walls for the rest of the year. This was approved for construction by the committee, and since then it has somewhat gone out of my hands. So here it is before it appears as a reality under a D&B contract with somebody else's architect. I won't describe any more of it. I believe it's under construction now. The client brought in his own interior designer. That's what happened. Here again is a final project which we worked on for the last year. This is a new hospital in North London, or rather a home for the elderly, a 200-bed home for the elderly and disabled, which has our plan for it had at its focus a prayer hall, which you see on the plan on the left, a small round thing looking suspiciously like a plagiarized version of one's own previous project in the middle of it. But we wish to focus it around that for various reasons, that not being necessarily one of them. We are no longer architects to this project, which is now being done by Michael and Patty Hopkins. On the right is a computer illustration of the proposed facade. And finally, our ambition on the topic of sacred space is to build a new pantheon. And these are the beginnings of a plan which we hope to bring about by public subscription. Thank you very much.
I recognise those last two. Anyway,
Oh,
would
David was the tutor.
would
Oh dear.
anybody like to comment, or it's been customary in the last 3 or 4 lectures this time to have questions. Toby.
There was a moment in the work where very large questions were being asked from the Purist on architecture, referring after work carried out conditions on
Every architect, I think, is only too familiar with acquiring labels provided by others for things they just did not see that they were doing. I have no idea that I was anything to do with neoclassical, any more than we were neo-purists in the 1960s. So I can't answer that because I don't think that what we've been doing recently has anything to do with neoclassicism. But other people have mentioned this, I must admit. But that's one part of the answer. The other part about natural is explorations that you particularly might find, you found that were of more interest earlier on, around a certain time. All I can say is that I've been working with, in my view, it has been a matter of expanding through preparedness to open one's eyes to different aspects of the world and their possible interpretation in architecture. I was helped in this by having returned to the area and working with the likes of Jean and Paul and Peter Wilson and so forth, and other people I've worked with. And I've only seen it as various aspects of an attempt to, on a hopefully firm foundation of planning, of organizational planning that was concise, to develop the vocabulary. And all these have each in their turn been different paths to look at what there was to offer, which you could hope to interpret in terms of architecture. I can see the point you're making if it is that one's sort of not doing that anymore and appear to be in a neoclassical tramline, but I don't see it that way. I can tell you one thing that I do feel that I do know occurred, that when we acquired a building to do that was in itself filled with significance, one realized that a great amount of work that we were engaged in, which others have been engaged in over a period in the 70s, 80s, has been the attempt to bestow meaning upon meaningless buildings. Because when we found we had a large part of the explorations and experiments that have been occurring in schools and in practice in leading theoretical in theory in architecture seemed to me to have had a negative side, which is an attempt to bestow meaning upon buildings or an environment and a program and a situation that has not enough meaning. When you find yourself with a building that is, and a program and a client where every aspect of it has meaning already, which you cannot feel is an inadequate meaning, then one has returned to a more abstract vocabulary. And it is not necessary to invent, to bestow upon the building a kind of poetry that you may feel you have researched, because it already has it. Every part of a synagogue, for example, every window, door, piece of furniture, every object and accoutrement in the building is already filled with significance. The client, in fact, of course, was a fundamentalist type client who didn't want any ornament, but at the same time, we didn't want to do any.
Anybody else? Excuse me. Anybody else? Any thoughts?
I thought all architects were stuck with the inability to do what they visualized. and we're all in pain over it. I may be wrong. I thought this was an undercurrent to all architects' work. You can't do what you would like to do, put it simply. Therefore, there is a pathos built in. We're inadequate to architecture. Architecture is too big and too difficult. But we are so familiar with walking around the streets, knowing that the environment we have around us. I mean, there's a component in architects which is like the plumber or the dentist as well, who sucks their teeth at looking at your dentist, look in your mouth and see the work done by another dentist and say, "Who did this job? Terrible." Your car repair mechanic will look in under the bonnet and suck his teeth and go, "Whoever did this, I don't know, whoever did that one, I mean, it's terrible." Well, there's an aspect of that. We all go around, looking at the entire environment by others, done by other architects, and think of it that way. Oh, who did you get to do that building over there? It's impossible, very not good enough. And then, of course, it's exactly the same when you look at your own buildings. Not anything like it should have been, for one reason or another. That's the pathos, and I think that is common to us all. I don't want to sort of push it.
Well, I think because the party upstairs is about to begin, I think, for no other reason than that, actually, I think I'd like to draw the evening to a close, because for me it's been actually very moving seeing Mike show such an enormous collection of works and trajectory of exploration, drawn, written, agonized over, drawn in so many different media too, on computer more recently, and that fantastic period of incredibly eloquent coloured crayon drawings, which seemed to rhyme so much with other things that were going on in this country and in the school. And one moment that I was sad was left out was the teaching here, and particularly the short course for architecture, which I think was one of the most spectacular moments in the school in brief period in the 80s, decade, I hope so. And one where there were a number of projects which have stuck in my mind, like Arda Wilson's nightclub and Robert Griffin's Twisted Tower, which seemed to inform some of the projects that we seem to have had in a way that was enriching and valuable. I've enjoyed this evening myself. I hope you have. Next week, Jeremy Dixon will be presenting his work from the early period and more recently, and the series will finish the week after with Edward Jones is here in the front. Thank you very much tonight.
Drink.